March 22, 1944, 7:45 in the morning. Boxted Advanced Airfield, Essex County, England. Robert James McKenna, 61, adjusted his wire-rimmed glasses with calloused fingers as he examined the Republic P-47 Thunderbolt's 2,000-horsepower Pratt and Whitney R-2800 engine that stood before him like a bull of aluminum and steel. His stark white hair, neatly combed to the left as men of his generation did, contrasted sharply with the 20-something mechanics working on the fighter planes around him, and his hands shook slightly, not from nervousness, but from 43 years of tuning tractor, harvester, and truck engines on Kansas farms. The deep wrinkles around his eyes, carved by decades under the relentless sun of the American plains, looked like topographical maps of a lifetime away from military academies or aeronautical engineering schools. McKenna had spent the last 38 years as an itinerant mechanic, traveling from farm to farm through Kansas, Nebraska, and Iowa, repairing anything with an engine, from small diesel generators to huge international harvester threshing machines. He knew about radial engines because he had kept dozens of old farm planes that sprayed pesticides over wheat fields running, temperamental machines that young pilots found impossible to keep reliable. His retirement, beginning in January of 1942 at the age of 59, consisted of fishing on the Kansas River and caring for his 4 grandchildren in the small frame house in Topeka that he had built in 1917. Then came Pearl Harbor. McKenna listened to the radio that Sunday in December, watched her oldest daughter cry because her husband was stationed at Hickam Field, and on Monday morning was in line at the recruiting office. The recruiting sergeant, a young man of perhaps 26 in an impeccable uniform, looked at the old farmer with a mixture of respect and pity. McKenna didn't enlist as a soldier. He volunteered as a hired civilian mechanic, and after 3 months of bureaucratic paperwork and medical exams that he passed, despite medical expectations about arthritis and high blood pressure, he found himself boarding a Liberty ship called the John P. Gaines, headed for England. Now, 18 months later, he supervised the maintenance of 16 P-47 Thunderbolts of the 352nd Fighter Group, and his arthritic fingers could diagnose engine problems by sound and vibration alone that men 30 years his junior couldn't even notice. All around him, the characteristic mist of the English morning was beginning to lift, revealing rows of fighters painted in dark olive green and neutral gray camouflage schemes, each weighing 7 tons when fully loaded with 50 caliber ammunition and auxiliary fuel tanks. McKenna touched the engine hood reverently, feeling the cool metal beneath his palm, and thought of his 10-year-old grandson Tommy, who wrote letters asking if Grandpa had ever seen a real airplane up close. Tommy couldn't imagine that Grandpa not only saw planes daily, but flew the most lethal machines America had ever produced, fighter jets that crossed the English Channel to bring war directly to the heart of Nazi Germany. 6 weeks earlier, February 19, 1944, Berlin, headquarters of the Luftwaffe Supreme Command, Reichsluftfahrtministerium. General Major Adolf Galland, 32 years old, fighter ace with 104 confirmed victories, and commander of the Luftwaffe fighter force, leafed through the intelligence report on American air capabilities with an expression that mixed incredulity and barely concealed disdain. He called his deputy, Hauptmann Franz Stigler, 27 years old, and a 3-year veteran of combat on the Western Front, and read aloud the passages he considered most absurd. The words in the typed report were too clear to be misunderstood, but too ridiculous to be taken seriously. The Americans, according to Abwehr intelligence sources, were hiring civilian mechanics, many over 55, some as old as 65, to keep their fighter air forces operational in England. These men, the report emphasized with an almost apologetic tone, had no formal military training in aviation. Many came from farms in the American Midwest, and their experience was with farm tractors, not high-performance fighter jets. Galland slammed the report down on the polished mahogany table with enough force to make his inkwell rattle. "Stigler, get up and listen to this," he ordered, with a voice full of cynical amusement. Americans entrust the maintenance of their P-47 Thunderbolts, machines that cost $83,000 each and have 2,000 horsepower engines, to retired farmers who have probably never flown in a commercial airliner, much less understood the complexity of an 18-cylinder, double-row radial engine. Our Luftwaffe, Stigler mechanics, are trained for at least 3 years in specialized technical schools. Many are engineers trained at the Technical University of Berlin or the University of Munich. They are all between 22 and 35 years old, at ideal physical strength. And yet we consider that we need 2 highly qualified mechanics for every Focke-Wulf 190 or Messerschmitt 109 that we keep operational, and the Americans send old farmers. Stigler, who had personally inspected Luftwaffe maintenance units and knew the level of precision required, nodded in agreement. Herr General, this only confirms our analysis that Americans are industrially powerful, but technically incompetent. They produce quantity, we produce quality. When a P-47 crashes not due to combat, but due to mechanical failure caused by inadequate maintenance, by some old man who is supposed to be growing corn, that is a victory for us, without wasting a bullet. Galland lit a Cuban cigar, a luxury his position allowed, and watched the smoke rise in lazy spirals. "There's more," he continued, returning to the report. "Apparently, many of these American civilian mechanics work in conditions that would violate all Luftwaffe regulations on aircraft maintenance. They improvise tools, work outdoors even in rain and snow, and according to a captured American prisoner of war who was a P-47 pilot, some of these old mechanics can change a complete engine in 8 hours, what our own mechanics would take 12 to 14 hours. The prisoner classified it as thanks to their experience with agricultural machinery. Galland laughed, a harsh sound without genuine humor. Experience with agricultural machinery. Stigler, we have mechanics who have studied metallurgy, thermodynamics, aerodynamics, precision tolerances in aeronautical components, and Americans believe that fixing a John Deere tractor qualifies someone to maintain a modern fighter jet. He filed the report in a folder marked Dubious Allied Propaganda and turned his attention to more serious issues such as the growing shortage of aviation fuel and the relentless pressure from American B-17 and B-24 bombers arriving in formations of hundreds of aircraft protected by increasingly P-47 and P-51. What Galland didn't know, what no amount of training at German military academies could have prepared him to understand, was that men like Robert McKenna saw radial engines not as precision engineering mysteries, but as larger, more complex versions of the machines they had kept running through Great Depressions, Dust Bowls, brutal winters, and scorching summers, using wire, creativity, and an intuitive understanding of mechanics that no textbook could teach. The difference between Galland's world and McKenna's world was not just one of age or experience, but of fundamental operating philosophy. In Germany, the Luftwaffe had built its aircraft maintenance system on principles of absolute precision and rigid hierarchy. Each mechanic went through Lehre, the traditional German apprenticeship system that lasted 3 full years, during which young people aged 16 to 19 learned not only to repair airplanes, but to understand the engineering theory behind each component. They studied fuel chemistry, the metallurgy of aeronautical alloys, the mathematics of torques and stresses, the physics of airflow through carburetors. A Luftwaffe engine mechanic knew how to calculate with engineering precision the exact compression of each cylinder, the ideal operating temperature of each component, and the structural limits of each part. The system produced extraordinarily skilled technicians, men who could literally build engines from boxes of spare parts and ensure that each engine ran within factory specifications with Swiss chronometer precision. But this system had hidden costs. 3 years of training meant that each mechanic represented a massive investment of time and resources. The Luftwaffe had approximately 28,000 aircraft mechanics in 1944, a number that seemed impressive until it was compared with the magnitude of the air operations that Germany attempted to maintain on 3 fronts simultaneously. Every mechanic was too precious a resource to save. It was risky, which meant they worked from well-protected bases, far from the front lines, in facilities with appropriate tools and appropriate spare parts. When Allied bombers destroyed these facilities, as they did with increasing frequency, the Luftwaffe's maintenance capability suffered disproportionate damage because the system lacked the flexibility to adapt. Meanwhile, in the United States, the approach was radically different and born not of theory, but of pragmatic necessity. In December 1941, the United States Army Air Force had only about 2,000 qualified aircraft mechanics. The need to expand this to tens of thousands in a matter of months forced an improvisation that traditional commanders considered desperation, but which would prove to be accidental genius. The Air Corps began recruiting men who had never touched an airplane, but who had decades of experience keeping engines of all types running in adverse conditions. Farmers who kept harvesters operating 16 hours a day during harvest. Truck mechanics repairing diesel engines in the middle of snowstorms in Montana. Mining equipment operators improvising repairs 3,000 meters above sea level in the Appalachians. These men did not know thermodynamic equations, but they knew by the sound when a cylinder was failing. They couldn't calculate structural stresses, but they could tell by metal fatigue when a part was about to break. They didn't have a degree, but they had something no school could teach: decades of experience solving complex mechanical problems with limited resources under extreme pressure. Robert McKenna perfectly exemplified this type of unconventional expertise. When he arrived at Boxted in September of 1943, at the age of 60, the maintenance commander of the 352nd Fighter Group, Major Thomas Henderson, 34 years old and a graduate of West Point Military Academy, looked at the old farmer and immediately assumed that someone in command had made a terrible bureaucratic error. Henderson had studied mechanical engineering, understood engine theory, and was convinced that modern fighter maintenance required technical knowledge that simply did not exist outside a formal academic environment. But the war was producing brutal attrition in personnel, and Henderson did not have the luxury of rejecting volunteers, even if they seemed unlikely. He assigned McKenna to work under the supervision of a younger technical sergeant, figuring the older man would be useful for simple tasks like cleaning and organizing tools. The illusion lasted exactly 3 days. In his first week at Boxted, McKenna was silently watching as a team of 4 young mechanics, all under 26, and all trained at Air Force technical schools, struggled with P-47s that had returned from a mission over Germany, showing significant loss of power. They had spent 5 hours diagnosing the problem using standard procedures from the technical manual, checking cylinder compression, testing magnetos, inspecting spark plugs, examining the fuel system. Each test indicated that everything was working within specifications, but the engine continued to deliver only 70% of its normal power. The sergeant in charge, Frank Morrison, 24, was about to classify the aircraft as non-operational and require a complete engine replacement, a process that would take at least 3 days and remove a fighter from the front line at a time when each aircraft was critical. McKenna, who was supposedly just observing to learn Air Force procedures, approached the exposed engine and stood there for what seemed like too long a moment, just listening and watching. So he asked permission to touch the engine, and when Morrison, frustrated and out of options, agreed, McKenna placed his calloused hand on a specific part of the engine block, closed his eyes, and asked Morrison to start the engine for 10 seconds. The engine roared to life, ran as badly as before, and was shut down. McKenna opened his eyes, went to his makeshift toolbox, a wooden ammunition box that he had lined with fabric, and pulled out a torque wrench. Without consulting a manual or taking measurements, he adjusted 4 specific screws on the engine's gear reduction mounting ring. Each adjustment just 1/8 of a turn. "Call again," he said simply. Morrison, skeptical but curious, restarted the engine. The P-47 roared with a completely different sound, powerful and smooth, all 2,000 horsepower flowing as it should. Morrison turned off the engine and looked at McKenna with an expression that mixed with which is almost reverence. "How the hell did you know?" he asked. his voice carrying the frustration of someone who had spent 5 hours following correct procedures to no avail. McKenna wiped his hands on a dirty rag and explained in the calm voice of someone who had taught generations of apprentices. "Son, you checked everything the manual told you to check, and you did it right. But this engine suffered structural torsion, probably when the pilot made a sudden evasive maneuver under combat load. It's not enough to show up in compression measurements or affect magnets, but it's enough to misalign the gear reduction assembly by a fraction of a millimeter. This creates harmonic vibration that steals power. I felt the vibration when I touched the block, a specific pattern I recognized because I ran a Wright Whirlwind radial engine in an agricultural plane for a dozen years in the 1930s, and that old engine had the same tendency to misalign under stress. You would never find this in manuals because the manual assumes that structure stays perfectly aligned, which is true 99% of the time, but not when you're pulling 6 Gs running away from Messerschmitt." Morrison was silent for a long moment, processing what he had just heard. "So you diagnosed a complex structural problem just by touching the engine," he said slowly, not as a question, but as someone trying to believe what he had just witnessed. McKenna smiled, a modest smile that wrinkled his weathered face even more. "Son, I spent 43 years listening to engines talk to me. You learn their language, eventually." That night, Morrison went to Major Henderson's tent and reported the incident. Henderson, initially skeptical, personally checked out the P-47 the following day and confirmed that it was operational and delivering full power. He summoned McKenna for a private conversation and asked a direct question. "How many more of these non-standard problems would you be able to diagnose?" McKenna thought for a moment, adjusted his glasses, and responded with characteristic honesty. "Major, I don't know the theory behind these engines like your boys do. I can't calculate the mathematics of combustion or explain the chemistry of 130-octane jet fuel. But I can hear when an engine is hurting, I can feel when something is wrong, and I can fix most problems using principles I learned from keeping machines running when there were no spare parts, technical manuals, or appropriate tools." Henderson made a decision at that moment that violated every Air Force operations manual, but that his instincts told him was absolutely correct. He promoted McKenna to Engine Diagnostics Supervisor, a position that didn't officially exist, but that McKenna would fill perfectly. From that day on, any P-47 that presented a mechanical problem that conventional mechanics could not resolve was taken to McKenna. Within 3 months, McKenna had diagnosed and resolved 47 complex problems that would have resulted in complete engine replacements, saving the fighter group approximately $3,900,000 in equipment costs, and, most importantly, maintaining 47 fighters on the front line that would otherwise have been grounded. McKenna's story was not unique. It was just one of thousands of similar stories that were unfolding at American air bases throughout England, North Africa, and the Pacific. In East Wretham, home base of the 358th Fighter Group, there was Charles Wellington Thompson, 63 years old, a former blacksmith from Montana, who had spent 42 years forging horseshoes, farm tools, and replacement parts for anything that needed shaped metal. Thompson had no formal education beyond the 8th grade at a rural school, but he understood metal in a way that metallurgical engineers with doctorates envied. When P-47 began experiencing fatigue cracks in weapons mounting brackets after intense combat missions, Republic aviation engineers were consulted and estimated that it would take 6 weeks to design, test, and produce reinforced brackets. Thompson watched the cracks for 15 minutes, measured them with his trained eye, and then spent 2 days in the makeshift forge he had constructed using a 200-gallon oil drum and charcoal, producing reinforced supports that not only solved the problem, but proved to be 38% stronger than the original factory components. When Republic engineers finally analyzed Thompson's work, they discovered that he had intuitively applied stress distribution principles that were part of advanced metallurgical research, principles that he could not name or explain mathematically, but that he understood viscerally from decades of working metal under fire and a sledgehammer. At Debden, home base of the 4th Fighter Group, there was Martha Wilson Andrews, 58, a former Boston seamstress who had spent 36 years sewing fine clothes, wedding dresses, and custom suits for Beacon Hill's elite. Andrews had no experience with airplanes, but when she arrived in England as part of the Wassy Women's Army Corps in October 1943, she was initially assigned to administrative work that she felt wasted her skills. She observed mechanics struggling to repair bullet damage to the P-47's aluminum control surfaces and recognized the problem as essentially similar to mending delicate silk fabric. Andrews proposed a repair technique using aluminum patches applied with a process she adapted from her sewing knowledge, and despite initial skepticism, her technique proved to be not only faster than standard procedures, but also stronger, allowing fighters with combat damage to return to service in hours rather than days. Within 6 months, Andrews's technique was being taught as standard procedure for field repairs of damaged control surfaces. In the Pacific, at Forward Base Nadzub, New Guinea, there was James Robert Santiago, 55 years old, a former tuna fisherman from San Diego who had spent 33 years in the Pacific, knowing the ocean in ways that navigation books could never teach. Santiago was not a mechanic. He was a civilian navigator hired to help young P-47 pilots understand weather patterns over the ocean, complex air currents that could mean the difference between returning to base or running out of fuel over water. Pilots of 23, 24, many from the American Midwest who had never seen the ocean before the war, learned from Santiago to read cloud formations, recognize signs of storms 100 miles away, use high-altitude wind currents to save precious fuel. Santiago could not explain formal meteorology, but he could predict weather with an accuracy that trained meteorologists envied, simply because he had spent 3 decades observing ocean and sky with the undivided attention of a man whose life depended on such observation. His informal instruction saved an estimated 16 pilot lives who would have been lost in weather conditions that official weather reports did not predict, but that Santiago instantly recognized. These stories, multiplied by the thousands throughout the entire American military structure, created an operational advantage that Axis commanders not only underestimated, but literally could not comprehend. The German and Japanese military systems were built on principles of rigid hierarchy, formal specialization, and strict separation between theoretical knowledge and practical application. A German engineer was trained to design, a technician was trained to build, a mechanic was trained to maintain. Crossing these lines was considered not only irregular, but fundamentally incorrect, a violation of the natural order of expertise. When the American system began to produce results that contradicted all German expectations, the initial reaction was not admiration, but confusion, followed by denial. Adolf Galland himself experienced this cognitive dissonance directly and painfully in April 1944, when combat reports began to show a disturbing pattern. P-47 Americans who had been damaged in combat, planes that should have been grounded for days or weeks awaiting complex repairs, were returning to combat in a matter of hours. Galland ordered a detailed investigation, suspecting that reports were being falsified, or that German pilots were exaggerating damage caused. The investigation confirmed that reports were correct. The Americans had developed field repair capabilities that exceeded anything the Luftwaffe considered possible. What Galland didn't know was that this ability came not from superior technology or revolutionary engineering discovery, but from men like McKenna, Thompson, and Andrews, who viewed problems through the lens of practical experience rather than academic theory. On April 28, 1944, Galland received a report that finally forced him to confront the reality he had been avoiding. Hauptmann Josef Priller, commander of the 26th Jagdgeschwader and ace with 101 confirmed victories, sent a detailed analysis of the combat that had taken place over Munich 3 days earlier. Priller had led formation of 32 Focke-Wulf 190A8 against escort of P-17 protecting B-17 bombers. The mathematics of aerial combat favored the Germans, 32 fighters versus approximately 50 and 47. But German pilots were seasoned veterans, while many American pilots had fewer than 20 combat missions. Priller expected a decisive result. The fight lasted 18 minutes. The Germans shot down 8 confirmed P-47s, a respectable number. But they lost 13 Focke-Wulf, a devastatingly unfavorable exchange rate. More disturbing still, Priller reported that at least 15 of the P-47 involved in combat showed visible signs of recent combat damage repairs, metal patches on airframes, panel replacements, marks of pricey field work. Those planes were supposed to be out of service, Priller wrote in his report. Some showed damage that our own maintenance standards would classify as requiring a return to the major repair deposit. However, they were flying combat missions and fighting effectively. Galland read the report 3 times. He called an emergency staff meeting and posed the question directly: how do Americans maintain operational availability rates that exceed ours, despite flying more frequent missions and taking more combat damage? No one had a satisfactory answer. The German system assumed that proper maintenance required time, appropriate tools, precisely manufactured parts, and highly trained technicians working in protected facilities. Americans apparently achieved equivalent or superior results using methods that violated all of these principles. The answer, which Galland would never fully discover, lay on the muddy field at Boxted that morning of March 22, 1944, where Robert McKenna was teaching 3 young mechanics how to diagnose carburetor problems using techniques he had developed while keeping farm equipment running during the Dust Bowl of 1935. The skies over England were clear for the first time in 5 days, a rare window of good weather that meant a long-range mission was being planned. McKenna knew that each P-47 needed to be in perfect condition, because the mission would take them deep into German territory, possibly as far as Berlin, a distance that was at the absolute limit of the Thunderbolt's range, even with auxiliary fuel tanks. He was adjusting the fuel mixture in engine number 7, an aircraft piloted by Lieutenant David Morrison, 23 years old, from Iowa, when he heard the familiar sound of military boots approaching at a rapid pace. It was Major Henderson with news that McKenna had been simultaneously hoping and fearing. Henderson explained that command had approved a massive operation for the following day, March 23rd, an incursion of 600 B-17 and B-24 bombers escorted by all available P-47 and P-51. The target would be the industrial complex in Berlin. It would be a devastating psychological blow, bringing war to the heart of the Reich's capital in broad daylight, but it would also be an extremely risky operation because distance would require fighters to fly at the absolute limit of their range. Henderson needed assurance from McKenna that every P-47 of the 352nd Group was in a condition to fly a mission that would allow no room for mechanical failure. McKenna wiped his hands, adjusted his glasses, and gave Henderson the answer the Major needed to hear. All 16 Thunderbolts were ready. But then McKenna added something Henderson didn't expect. "Major," he said, in a voice that carried the weight of 4 decades of experience, "I can guarantee that these engines are in better condition than when they left the factory. But you need to understand something about modern warfare that they don't teach at West Point. The side that wins is not necessarily the side with the smartest engineers or bravest soldiers. It's the side that can keep its machines running when theoretically they shouldn't work, that can improvise solutions when correct solutions are not available, that has people willing to apply decades-old knowledge even when that knowledge doesn't come from books or schools. The Germans have a better system than ours on paper. Its mechanics are younger, stronger, better formally trained. But they are slaves to their manuals and procedures. When something breaks in a way that the manual doesn't cover, they are stuck. We Americans, especially us old folks who come from farms and workshops, have learned to fix things that shouldn't be fixable. And that, Major, is as important a military advantage as any weapon we can carry." Henderson was silent for a moment, absorbing words of the old mechanic. Then he reached out, shook McKenna's calloused hand, and said simply, "Thank you, Bob. Not just for the engines, but for the lesson." That night, McKenna wrote a letter to his wife Martha. Letters he sent weekly but which she received irregularly due to the unpredictable nature of wartime mail. He could not share details of the planned mission due to operational security, but he wrote about pilots he had gotten to know, young men of 22, 23, 25, who could have been his grandchildren and who flew into battle with courage that made him simultaneously proud and anguished. He wrote about how the work he was doing, keeping these engines running, was perhaps the most important thing he had done in his life, more important than 42 years of building houses and repairing machines, because now every engine he repaired could save a young pilot's life or contribute to defeating the tyranny that threatened to engulf the civilized world. While McKenna was writing from an English base across the English Channel in bomb-ravaged Berlin, General Major Adolf Galland was having a tense conversation with Hermann Göring, Reichsmarschall and Supreme Commander of the Luftwaffe. Göring, who had promised Hitler that no enemy bombers would ever reach Berlin, was facing the reality that American and British bombers were now attacking the German capital regularly. Galland was trying to explain that the Luftwaffe was losing not necessarily because German planes were inferior or less skilled pilots, but because Americans had achieved something that Germany could not replicate, an operational availability rate that allowed them to put hundreds of fighters in the air day after day, while the Luftwaffe struggled to keep its forces operational. Göring, furious, and refusing to accept that any aspect of American operations could be superior to German ones, blamed pilots, blamed production plants, blamed imaginary saboteurs. Galland, with considerable courage given Göring's volatile temperament, insisted that the problem was more fundamental. The Americans, he explained, had mobilized civilian resources in ways that Germany had not attempted. They were using the knowledge and experience of the civilian population in unconventional ways that produced results that exceeded traditional military capabilities. Göring, whose understanding of war was informed by experiences from the First World War, where separation between military and civilian was absolute, simply could not process the concept. Galland, frustrated but knowing his argument was futile, left the meeting with the grim understanding that the Luftwaffe was doomed not by technical inferiority, but by institutional inflexibility, an inability to adapt and innovate in the way the Americans were doing. On the morning of March 23, 1944, 3 hours and 15 minutes in the morning, McKenna woke up before the alarm. He had only slept 4 hours, but decades of waking up before dawn to care for farm animals had trained his body to function on limited sleep. He dressed silently so as not to wake other men in the barracks, stepped out into the biting cold of the English dawn, and walked to the flight line where his 16 P-47s waited like metal sentries in the dim light of scatter lamps. He spent the next hour and a half doing a final check of each engine, not because official procedures required it, but because his conscience would not allow him to send these pilots into battle without personally ensuring that each engine was in optimal condition. At 5:30 minutes in the morning, pilots began arriving for mission briefing. McKenna watched as they received their orders, saw maps showing the route that would take them over Holland, through Germany, to Berlin. He saw expressions on young faces, the mix of excitement, fear, and determination that characterized men about to fly into potentially lethal combat. At 6:45 in the morning, engines began to roar to life one by one. 2,000 horsepower multiplied by 16 fighters producing deafening thunder that shook the earth. McKenna stood at the edge of the runway, hands in the pockets of his grease-stained coveralls, watching as each P-47 taxied into takeoff position. Lieutenant Morrison, pilot of the aircraft that McKenna had spent the most time maintaining, waved to the old mechanic as he passed, a gesture of recognition and gratitude. McKenna waved back, a simple wave that carried the weight of all his hope that his work would be enough to bring these boys back alive. The formation took off at 7:06 minutes in the morning. 16 Thunderbolt LTAs of the 352nd Group, joining hundreds of other fighter bases across England. McKenna watched until the last dots disappeared into the increasingly bright sky, then returned to the maintenance line where work was already waiting, because returning planes would need immediate service to be ready for the next mission. The attacking force that crossed the English Channel that morning represented the greatest concentration of American air power up to that point in the war. 623 heavy bombers, protected by 891 fighters, a total of 1,514 combat aircraft flying in formation that stretched across 100 miles of sky. The Germans detected the incursion via the Freya radar network before the formation even crossed the Dutch coast, and every Luftwaffe fighter unit in West Germany was ordered to take off to intercept. It was exactly the kind of massive battle that the Luftwaffe had been avoiding, because its losses in previous engagements had reduced its forces to the point where large engagements meant unsustainable losses. But Berlin was a target that could not be left unprotected without devastating political consequences. Jagdgeschwader 1, 2, 3, 11, and 26 elite Luftwaffe units took off to intercept. 213 Focke-Wulf 190 A8 and Messerschmitt 109 G14, piloted by experienced veterans, many aces with more than 50 confirmed victories, went up to face the American fleet. First contact occurred at 9:32 in the morning over Osnabrück, when forward elements of P-47 encountered a German reconnaissance patrol. The ensuing battle quickly escalated as more and more fighters from both sides were pulled into combat. The sky over West Germany exploded into chaos of aircraft running at top speed, tracers streaking through the air, burning aircraft falling in deadly spirals. For young P-47 pilots, many in only their fifth or sixth combat, it was a nightmarish sight. Skies full of enemy aircraft flown by men with years of combat experience. But the Thunderbolts had advantages that offset the German pilots' experience. They were built like flying tanks, capable of absorbing damage that would take down lighter fighters. Its PWR-2800 radial engines, maintained with obsessive dedication by men like McKenna, delivered reliable power even when damaged. And they were numerous, 300 P-47 against 213 German fighters. But more significant was that behind these 300 was a maintenance system that ensured that even damaged aircraft would return to combat quickly, whereas the Luftwaffe had no such luxury. The combat over Osnabrück lasted 23 minutes of brutal intensity. When it finally dispersed, 17 P-47s had been shot down, but 31 German fighters were falling in flames or had been abandoned by parachute pilots. Most significantly, of the 17 Thunderbolts lost, 7 pilots were rescued by Allied ground forces or managed to return to Allied territory in terribly damaged aircraft that remained flying due to robustness of design and quality of maintenance. The bomber formation continued inexorably toward Berlin, and P-47 reformed escorts. More fighting broke out over Brunswick, then over Magdeburg, then in the suburbs of Berlin. Each time the pattern was similar, German fighters attacking fiercely, inflicting losses but suffering even greater losses, and there were always more P-47s arriving as German forces were gradually overwhelmed. At 11:15 in the morning, bombs began to fall on Berlin. Most of the bomber formation reached targets and dropped explosive charges on factories, railroad yards, and military installations. The noise was apocalyptic, hundreds of tons of explosives detonating in sequence, creating a column of smoke visible from 100 kilometers away. In his deeply buried bunker, Adolf Hitler was informed that the Reich's capital was being bombed in broad daylight, and that the Luftwaffe, despite fighting bravely, had failed to stop the attack. For a dictator who had promised that Germany was invincible, it was intolerable humiliation. On the way back, German forces attempted another interception over Hanover, but their forces were exhausted, low on ammunition and fuel. P-47, still relatively fresh because its pilots had been trained in energy conservation tactics, repelled attacks with devastating effectiveness. As the sun began to descend, surviving American aircraft began crossing the Dutch coast, back over the English Channel. Of the 891 fighters that had taken off that morning, 748 returned. 143 were lost, a loss rate of 16%, which was high but considered acceptable given the magnitude of the operation. But the statistic that really mattered was that 213 German fighters had engaged 891 Americans, and only 124 German fighters returned. Luftwaffe had lost 89 fighters, 42% of its force committed, an absolutely unsustainable attrition rate. More importantly, of the 748 P-47 and P-51 that returned, 316 had combat damage ranging from small bullet holes to significant structural damage. In the Luftwaffe system, 316 damaged aircraft would mean massive operational reduction of the fighter force for weeks, while repairs were completed using standardized procedures. In the American system, it meant intense but manageable work for maintenance crews led by men like McKenna. At Boxted, McKenna heard engines returning before he saw them. He was standing on the flight line with his team of young mechanics, watching the setting sky, when the distant sound of Pratt Whitney engines began to grow louder. One by one, P-47 of the 352 group appeared, some flying in clean formation, others clearly struggling to stay aloft. The first to land was the aircraft of Captain James Wilson, 32 years old, squadron commander. The Thunderbolt had bullet holes through the left wing, and part of the tail was missing, torn off by Focke-Wulf's 20mm cannon. But the engine purred smoothly, delivering reliable power that allowed Wilson to make a perfect landing. McKenna went to the aircraft as soon as the propeller stopped turning, and Wilson left the cabin with his face still marked by pressure lines from the oxygen mask. "Bob," he said simply, "that engine took at least 6 shots. I saw tracers hit the engine hood, but he never missed a beat. I don't know what you do with these engines, but keep doing it." McKenna surveyed damage while Wilson gave his debriefing report. The engine had actually taken multiple hits from 7.92mm caliber ammunition, standard German machine gun bullets. 3 bullets had penetrated the engine hood and impacted cylinders, but the PW radial engine's robust design meant that even with 3 of the 18 cylinders damaged, the engine continued to produce approximately 85% of normal power, more than enough to bring the pilot home. McKenna began assessment work, determining which damages could be repaired in the field and which would require component replacement. The next aircraft to land was piloted by Lieutenant Morrison. McKenna felt profound relief when he saw the young pilot emerge from the cockpit unharmed, but Morrison's Thunderbolt told the story of violent combat. Sides of the fuselage were riddled with holes, the acrylic canopy had cracks from fragments, and the right main landing gear had been partially damaged, causing the aircraft to land with a worrying tilt. Morrison saw McKenna's expression and smiled nervously. "It was intense up there, Bob. I've never seen so many Germans in one place. They came from everywhere, waves of them. But this plane," he patted the fuselage with affection, "this plane kept flying no matter what they threw at us. There's a moment I need to tell you, something you won't believe." Morrison explained that during combat over Berlin, he had been attacked by 3 Messerschmitt 109 simultaneously. One of them achieved perfect tail position and fired a 30mm cannon blast directly into the P-47's engine. Morrison felt impacts, saw black smoke pouring from the engine hood, and assumed it was over. Standard procedure would be to turn off the engine immediately and look for a place to parachute. But then, something unexpected happened. The black smoke disappeared after a few seconds, the engine returned to normal operation, and the instrument panel did not show any critical alerts. Morrison, operating more on instinct than logic, decided not to turn off the engine, and instead executed a violent evasive maneuver that took him out of the Messerschmitt's line of fire. The engine responded perfectly, delivering full power when Morrison needed it. He not only survived the encounter, but managed to reverse the situation, positioning himself for a deflection shot that damaged one of the Messerschmitts and forced the other 2 to break contact. "I flew back home," Morrison continued, still partly in disbelief at his own story, 450 kilometers away, over enemy territory, waiting every second for the engine to shut down. But he never hung up. It worked perfectly the entire trip back. When I asked for permission to land, Tower controller told me that I was trailing dark smoke and that I should consider bailing out. I told him that the engine was working too well to abandon the plane, and here I am. McKenna, along with two young mechanics, began careful inspection of the engine. What they discovered was testament to both the robustness of PWR-2800's design and the obsessive quality of McKenna's maintenance. A 30mm projectile had passed through the engine hood and exploded against the cylinder block, fragmenting into dozens of pieces that should have completely destroyed the engine. But two factors had saved the engine. First, McKenna had, in his preventive maintenance weeks earlier, applied corrosion protection treatment to all accessible internal surfaces of the engine compartment, a procedure that was not in technical manuals, but that McKenna had learned to protect critical components. This treatment, made with a compound that McKenna had improvised using grease, oil, and graphite powder, had created a protective layer that absorbed part of the fragment's energy. Second, McKenna had a habit of tightening all screws and connections slightly beyond manual specifications, not so much as to risk damage, but enough to ensure there was no play or vibration. This meant that when fragments impacted the engine, critical components remained secure rather than becoming dislodged. The result was that despite severe apparent damage, the engine had maintained sufficient structural and operational integrity to continue running. McKenna spent an hour and a half examining each damaged component, making detailed notes in his worn notebook. So he went back to Morrison and gave his diagnosis. "Lieutenant, you were lucky today. But it wasn't just luck. This engine took a hit that should have destroyed it, but robust design and careful maintenance gave you a safety margin that saved your life. I can repair this engine right here, without having to send it to the warehouse. It will take 18 to 20 hours of work, which means this plane will be flying again in 3 days. In the German system, this plane would be out of service for at least 6 weeks. That difference, multiplied by hundreds of aircraft, is part of why we are winning." Morrison was silent for a moment, then extended his hand to the old mechanic. "Bob, I owe my life to you, not just for maintenance, but because you care enough to do better work than manuals require. If I survive this war, I will tell my children and grandchildren about the 61-year-old mechanic who kept our planes flying when they theoretically weren't supposed to fly." Throughout that night and the following days, McKenna and his team worked almost continuous shifts repairing the damaged P-47s. Of the 16 Thunderbolts that had taken off that morning, 14 returned. 2 had been lost. 1 shot down over Germany with the pilot captured, the other so badly damaged that the pilot had to parachute over the English Channel and was rescued by a British patrol boat. Of the 14 that returned, 11 had combat damage ranging from trivial to severe. Using standardized procedures and normal resources available at major maintenance depots, these 11 airplanes would have required a combined total of approximately 68 days of specialized work to return to full operational status. McKenna and his team returned them to service in a combined total of 13 days. It wasn't a miracle. It was the application of practical knowledge, accumulated over decades of keeping complex machines running under adverse conditions with limited resources. It was the ability to look beyond what manuals said was possible and ask instead what was needed. It was a willingness to work 18-hour days when the situation required it, because a day's delay meant that the young pilot would fly the next mission in a less familiar plane instead of his own carefully tuned aircraft. While McKenna was working at Boxted, a similar story was unfolding at dozens of other bases across England. The 316 fighters that had returned damaged from the mission over Berlin represented a massive test of the American maintenance system, and the system passed the test in a way that surprised even American commanders. Within 5 days, 281 of these 316 fighters were operational again. A return-to-service rate of 89% in 5 days was statistically impossible by German standards, but it was happening because of thousands of men and women like McKenna, who brought unconventional expertise to solve conventional problems. In Berlin, Adolf Galland received reports of damage from the combat of March 23rd with increasing despair. 89 fighters lost in a single day, with 42 pilots killed or missing and 31 injured. This represented the loss of 14% of the Luftwaffe's total day fighter strength on the Western Front in a single operation. Mathematically, the Luftwaffe could not sustain such losses. But what really broke Galland's morale was not the number of casualties. It was the intelligence report on American recovery capabilities. Agents from the Abwehr, the German intelligence service, had managed to infiltrate observers near some American air bases in England, and reports coming back were disturbing. The Americans, reports said, were repairing damaged aircraft at a speed that seemed impossible. Aircraft that had returned with visible severe damage were flying again within days. The explanation offered by reports that maintenance was being conducted by older civilian technicians using non-standard methods sounded to Galland like an excuse for observer incompetence. He dismissed reports as improbable and turned his attention to the more immediate problem of how to defend Germany against the inevitable next wave of American bombers, with a fighter force that was being rapidly attrited. On March 28, 5 days after the devastating mission over Berlin, the Luftwaffe attempted a massive interception of another formation of American bombers, this time targeting Bremen. Galland assembled all available fighters, 187 aircraft, expecting to face perhaps 600 American fighters, given the losses they had inflicted 5 days earlier. Instead, they encountered approximately 840 fighters, a number that exceeded the previous pre-mission strength. Mathematically, this made no sense. The Americans had lost 143 fighters on March 23rd, but 5 days later, they had more fighters operational than before the mission. The only possible explanation was that the rate of production of new planes was unusually high, or the rate of repair of damaged planes was much faster than German intelligence had estimated, or both. The truth, which Galland would not discover until after the war, when he had access to American archives, was that both factors were at play, but repair rate was the more significant element. American factories were indeed producing P-47s at an impressive rate, but the flow of new planes to England took weeks due to the need for ocean shipping and assembly. The ability to return damaged planes to service quickly was what really kept operational numbers high, and that capability rested fundamentally on a maintenance system that utilized the expertise of thousands of older civilians like McKenna. The battle over Bremen lasted approximately 38 minutes and was a disaster for the Luftwaffe. 187 German fighters faced 840 American fighters and were simply overwhelmed by superior numbers. 56 German fighters were shot down, loss rate 30%. Luftwaffe had lost 145 fighters in 5 days, approximately 22% of its total day fighter strength on the Western Front. Such losses were absolutely unsustainable, and Galland knew that continuation at this rate would mean complete collapse of Germany's daytime air defense within weeks. He called an emergency meeting with his general staff and posed the question that everyone had been avoiding: how they could compete with an adversary who apparently had unlimited resources and the ability to replace losses faster than Germany could inflict damage. No one had a satisfactory answer, because the fundamental problem was that Germany was waging war on multiple fronts against enemies with combined populations and industrial capabilities that dramatically exceeded German resources. But there was another factor that Galland was beginning to suspect but couldn't clearly articulate. The German military system, built on principles of rigid hierarchy and formal specialization, was extremely efficient under ideal conditions but fragile when faced with prolonged attrition and the need for rapid adaptation. The American system, which appeared chaotic and unprofessional to German eyes, was actually more resilient because it incorporated flexibility, improvisation, and a diversity of expertise that allowed adaptation to changing circumstances. On April 6, 1944, 2 weeks after a mission to Berlin, the 351st Fighter Group received a new mission, this time to escort bombers attacking ball-bearing factories in Schweinfurt. Mission was considered extremely dangerous because Schweinfurt was a critical target that Germany would fiercely defend and was located deep in German territory. McKenna spent 26 hours uninterrupted over the 2 days leading up to the mission, ensuring that each P-47 was in absolutely perfect condition. He barely slept, keeping himself awake with strong coffee and a sense of responsibility that weighed on his shoulders like a physical burden. He knew that every small maintenance detail he neglected could mean the difference between the pilot returning alive or not returning at all. On the morning of the mission, he was at the point of physical exhaustion, but refused suggestions from other mechanics that he rest. At 6:40 in the morning, the P-47 began to taxi for takeoff. McKenna, as always, stood at the edge of the track watching. He had developed personal relationships with each of the pilots, knew their families from letters they shared, their dreams for after the war, their girlfriends and wives waiting at home. As Lieutenant Morrison passed by in his Thunderbolt, he saw that McKenna looked particularly tired and gestured that McKenna should rest. McKenna smiled and waved, but they both knew he wouldn't rest until everyone returned. The mission to Schweinfurt became one of the most brutal of the war. Luftwaffe defended target with desperate ferocity, launching 238 fighters in successive waves against bomber formation. Aerial battles broke out all over central Germany. P-47 fought brilliantly, shooting down 83 confirmed German fighters, but paid a heavy price. 38 Thunderbolts were shot down. The 352nd Group lost 4 of the 16 P-47 they sent on that mission. Among the losses was an aircraft piloted by Lieutenant David Morrison. Reports from pilots who witnessed their last battle indicated that Morrison had been attacked by 5 Focke-Wulfs 190 simultaneously while protecting a damaged bomber that was falling behind the formation. Morrison fought brilliantly, shooting down 2 of the attackers and damaging a third before his own plane suffered multiple critical hits. Witnesses saw Morrison's P-47 spiral out of control, engulfed in flames. Nobody saw parachutes. When surviving aircraft returned, McKenna was on the flight line waiting, counting each Thunderbolt that landed. When the count reached 12 and there were no more engines audible in the sky, he knew they had lost 4. Major Henderson approached with list of lost pilots. McKenna read Morrison's name and felt as if he had been physically hit. He had known the young man for 8 months, had kept his plane in perfect condition, had believed that careful work could protect these young men. But war was no respecter of care or dedication, only brutal odds, and Morrison had faced odds that even the best maintenance in the world could not overcome. McKenna worked the remainder of that day and the following night, repairing the 8 P-47s that returned damaged, working with silent, grim intensity. Younger mechanics on his team noticed a change in his behavior, but didn't know what to say. At 3 o'clock in the morning, Major Henderson found McKenna still working on the engine, hands stained with grease, face marked with exhaustion and grief. Henderson put his hand on the old mechanic's shoulder and said gently, "Bob, you need to rest. You're killing yourself at this rate." McKenna didn't look up from his work. "Major," he said in a voice hoarse with fatigue. Morrison was 23. He had a bride waiting in Iowa. He was going to get married when he returned home. He flew in a plane that I kept. I know I did everything I could. I know the engine worked perfectly until the end. But that doesn't change the fact that he's dead, and I'm here. The only way I can process this is by continuing to work, keeping these other 15 planes flying, doing everything in my power to make sure the other 15 pilots come back alive from the next mission. Henderson had no adequate words to respond. He stood there for a moment in sympathetic silence, then let McKenna continue his work. In the following months, the pace of operations intensified further as D-Day approached and the United States Army Air Forces sought to achieve complete air supremacy over France and Belgium. McKenna and thousands of other civilian mechanics across England worked shifts that often exceeded 18 hours a day. Attrition rate was brutal, but also it was success rate. In May 1944, operational availability of P-47 at bases in England reached 87%, an extraordinary number considering the intensity of combat operations. By comparison, the Luftwaffe struggled to keep 42% of its fighters operational. The difference was directly attributable to an American maintenance system that utilized the unconventional expertise of older civilians. Adolf Galland, faced with increasingly grim statistics, finally accepted the reality that the Luftwaffe was losing a war of attrition not because German planes were inferior or pilots less brave, but because the American system was fundamentally more resilient. At a staff meeting on May 28, 1944, he expressed this understanding in surprisingly frank terms. The Americans, he told his officers, had discovered something we Germans considered impossible. They have turned old farmers and civilian workers into aircraft maintenance technicians who are in many ways more effective than our own formally trained specialists. This is not because they are technically superior. It is because they bring decades of practical experience that allows them to improvise solutions that our rigid system does not allow. We build systems that work perfectly under ideal conditions, but break down under stress. They built a system that is chaotic but adaptable. And in protracted war, adaptability trumps perfection. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, Robert McKenna woke up at 2 o'clock in the morning, knowing that today would be the most important day of the war. Preparation had been obvious in recent weeks. Massive buildup of men and material in southern England. This would be the invasion that everyone had expected and feared. McKenna and his team worked through the night, ensuring that each P-47 was ready for support missions that would be absolutely critical to the success of the invasion. At 5 o'clock in the morning, the first of multiple waves of fighters took off. The sky over the English Channel suddenly became the most congested airspace in human history. Thousands of aircraft of all types moving in complex coordination. P-47 of the 352nd Group flew air defense suppression missions, attacking German anti-aircraft artillery positions and airfields. It was dangerous work, flying low under intense fire, but absolutely essential. Of the 16 P-47 that took off in that first wave, 15 returned, a remarkable number considering the intensity of the combat. But many returned damaged, pierced by anti-aircraft fire. McKenna and his team began frantic repair work because aircraft needed to be ready for the second wave of missions that afternoon. They worked with speed and efficiency born of months of practice, and 14 of the 15 damaged planes were operational again when the second wave had to take off at 2 in the afternoon. This pattern continued for weeks. Multiple missions per day, continuous damage, continuous repairs, an exhausting cycle that tested human limits of endurance. McKenna, now 62, was working 20-hour days, sleeping in short 2 to 3 hour shifts when absolutely necessary. Other mechanics, including much younger ones, were similarly exhausted, but work had to be done because every plane they kept flying meant more support for ground troops who were fighting and dying on the beaches and fields of Normandy. On June 20th, Major Henderson found McKenna sleeping, standing up against the wing of P-47. Henderson gently woke the old mechanic and ordered him to sleep for at least 8 hours, threatening to take him into custody if necessary to force rest. McKenna protested, but eventually agreed, acknowledging that he was at the point of physical collapse. He slept for 10 hours, the first proper rest in weeks, and woke up feeling simultaneously refreshed and guilty about taking time off from work. But Henderson was right. Humans are not machines, and McKenna could not serve effectively if he destroyed himself from exhaustion. When McKenna returned to work, he found a letter waiting for him, routed through the military mail system. It was from Martha, his wife, the first communication he had received in 5 weeks due to postal service interruptions caused by the invasion. Martha wrote about life in Topeka, about grandchildren growing up, about neighbors who had sons or husbands serving, about pride she felt that even at their age, Robert was contributing to the war effort in such a meaningful way. She ended the letter with a simple sentence that McKenna read and reread multiple times. "Zez, come home safe when this is all over. I need you here, and you've done more than your part." McKenna folded the letter carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket, close to his heart. He had no intention of returning home before the war ended, but the promise implicit in Martha's letter gave him a renewed sense of purpose. He was doing this not just for the young pilots who depended on his work, but for the future he and Martha and millions of others could have in a world free from tyranny. In August 1944, with Allied forces advancing across France, the intensity of air operations decreased slightly as the Luftwaffe retreated to defend German territory. McKenna took advantage of the relative pause to train younger mechanics in techniques he had developed. He held informal training sessions where he shared decades of practical knowledge, teaching young men in their 20s how to diagnose problems by sound, how to sense abnormal vibrations that indicated imminent failure, how to improvise repairs using available materials. Many of these young mechanics had initially seen McKenna as just an old farmer, but months of watching him work had turned skepticism into genuine reverence. In September 1944, the 352nd Fighter Group was transferred to an advanced base in France, near Reims. McKenna and maintenance crew followed along. Conditions in France were much more primitive than in England, literally working in mud fields with minimal equipment. But for McKenna, who had spent decades working in harsh conditions on rural farms, it was familiar. He improvised shelters to protect tools from rain, created work areas using salvaged materials, and kept P-47 flying in conditions that would have paralyzed conventional maintenance operations. It was during this period that an incident occurred that would become legendary in the group's histories. On October 15, 1944, P-47 returned from a mission with its engine severely damaged by anti-aircraft fire. Projectile fragment had penetrated the engine block and destroyed multiple critical components. Initial assessment determined which engine needed to be completely replaced, but the nearest spare engine was at a supply depot 240 kilometers away, and transportation would take at least 4 days due to road congestion caused by troop movements. But critical mission was planned for next morning, and every fighter was needed. McKenna examined the damaged engine for a long time, then announced that he could repair the engine on site in 12 hours. Major Henderson, now a lieutenant colonel due to promotions received for his group's exceptional performance, knew McKenna well enough not to question the old mechanic's assessment, but other officers were skeptical. The repair McKenna was proposing required partially disassembling the engine, fabricating a makeshift replacement part to replace the destroyed component, and reassembling everything without appropriate testing equipment. It was the type of repair that technical manuals said was impossible outside of a warehouse installation with specialized tools. McKenna started work at 7 in the afternoon, working under light from portable lamps powered by a noisy generator. He fabricated the replacement part using metal from an unrecoverable P-47 fuselage part that had been shot down the week before, shaping metal with hand tools and precision born of 43 years of experience. At 3 in the morning, he was testing the repaired engine. At 5 in the morning, P-47 was ready to fly. Pilot, a young lieutenant named Robert Patterson, 25 years old, took off at 6:15 in the morning and flew a 4-hour mission over Germany. Engine worked perfectly throughout the entire mission. When Patterson returned, he immediately sought out McKenna. "You are a wizard," he said simply. "That engine flew like it was new. I don't know how you did it, but thanks for keeping my ass alive for another day." McKenna, exhausted beyond words, just nodded and went to sleep in the makeshift tent. This incident and hundreds like it spread throughout the Air Force's maintenance structure created a cumulative effect that was statistically measurable and strategically significant. During the 6-month period from June to December 1944, the United States Army Air Forces maintained an average operational availability rate of 83% for frontline fighters, despite flying almost daily combat missions and sustaining continuous combat damage. Luftwaffe, in the same period, saw its availability rate drop by 4 income and 2% to just 28%. This difference of over 50 percentage points in operational availability meant that even when Germany had comparable numbers of aircraft on paper, they were able to get far fewer planes actually in the air. And this difference in operational availability was a crucial factor that led to complete Allied air supremacy over Western Europe at the end of 1944. Adolf Galland, in one of his last official acts before being removed from command in January 1945, due to conflicts with Hermann Göring, wrote a final report to the High Command analyzing reasons for the defeat of the Luftwaffe. Among many factors he cited, one particular paragraph deserves attention. "We fundamentally underestimate the nature of the American people," he wrote. "We saw them as industrially powerful but technically incompetent, capable of producing quantity but not quality." This assessment proved to be catastrophically incorrect. Americans have demonstrated an extraordinary ability to apply unconventional civilian expertise to military problems, creating a maintenance and repair system that exceeds our own capabilities despite using personnel that our standards would consider unqualified. Old American farm mechanics have proven to be as effective as our formally trained engineers, and in some ways more effective, because they bring flexibility and improvisation that our rigid system does not allow. This is a profound lesson about the nature of modern warfare that future generations of military officers must study carefully. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Robert McKenna, now 63, was at an air base in West Germany when news of the surrender was announced. He was working on the engine when the air warning siren, which had sounded countless times in recent years, signaling enemy attacks, sounded this time in a different pattern, a sign of victory. Men and women throughout the base began to scream and celebrate. McKenna carefully set his tools aside, cleaned his hands, and allowed himself a moment of deep emotion. He had spent 3 years and 5 months away from home. He had worked in conditions that men half his age found exhausting. He had lost count of how many engines he had repaired and how many pilots he had helped keep flying. He thought of all the young faces he had met, some who had survived and many who had not. He thought of Martha waiting at home, of grandchildren he hadn't seen grow up during years of war. And he thought about work he had done, not glamorous or heroic in traditional ways, but absolutely essential. McKenna returned to the United States in July 1945, arriving in New York on a Liberty ship named James Wilson. He received no parade or public ceremony. He was a hired civilian returning from duty, not a soldier parading through the streets with ribbons and confetti. He took the train from New York to Kansas City, then the bus to Topeka, carrying only a small suitcase with his few possessions. Martha was waiting at the bus station, and when McKenna got off the bus and saw his wife, hair grayer than he remembered, face lined with years of worry, he felt waves of emotion that threatened to overwhelm him. They hugged each other in silence for a long time, not needing words. Over the next few months, McKenna tried to return to normal life. He returned to his small farm, repaired fences that had fallen down during his absence, planted a garden, visited grandchildren who were now much older. But something had fundamentally changed in him. He had seen what was possible when people applied their skills to causes greater than themselves. He had experienced a sense of purpose and importance that ordinary farm work could not replicate. He found he couldn't just return to the peaceful retirement he had planned. In October 1945, McKenna received a letter from the United States Department of War. It was formal notification that he was being awarded the Civilian Meritorious Service Medal for his contributions to the war effort. The letter explained that Major, now Colonel Henderson, had recommended McKenna for reconnaissance, specifically citing that McKenna's maintenance work had kept P-47 flying in conditions that theoretically should have grounded aircraft, and that this capability had saved pilots' lives and contributed significantly to Allied air supremacy. A decoration ceremony was held at the Kansas City Air Force Base in November 1945. McKenna, wearing the only suit he owned, stood awkwardly as the two-star general placed the medal and read the citation in front of a small audience that included Martha, her 4 children, 7 grandchildren, and a handful of local officials. General explained that, of the thousands of civilians who had served in aircraft maintenance, McKenna was one of only 143 being especially recognized for exceptional contributions. After the ceremony, a Topeka newspaper reporter approached McKenna for an interview. A reporter, a young man who had not served in the war due to flat feet, asked questions that McKenna found superficial. "Do you feel like a hero? What was the most exciting moment?" "Do you have any dramatic stories to share?" McKenna responded patiently but honestly. "I'm not a hero," he said. "Heroes are young men who flew combat missions knowing they might not return. I just did work I knew how to do, keeping machines running. If it helped win the war, then it was worth every hour of hard work. As far as dramatic stories go, there's no drama in tightening screws correctly or diagnosing engine problems. There's just careful work done by people who care enough to get it right." An article appeared in the newspaper days later, a small item on page 8 that few readers noticed. But for McKenna, recognition was not a point. He had served because it was right to serve, because he had skills that were needed, because he couldn't stay at home knowing he could make a difference. In 1949, 4 years after the end of the war, McKenna received a surprise letter from Adolf Galland. After the war, Galland had been interrogated extensively by Allied intelligence officers and had subsequently written detailed memoirs of his experiences commanding Luftwaffe fighters. During research for the book, he had access to American archives and became fascinated by the American maintenance system that he had fought but never fully understood. Through meticulous research, he had identified several individuals who exemplified this system, and McKenna was one of them. Galland's letter was in halting English, clearly written with the help of a translator. Galland explained that he was writing to multiple American veterans as part of his effort to fully understand why the Luftwaffe had lost the air war. He asked specific questions about McKenna's training, work methods, and available resources. McKenna considered ignoring the letter, but curiosity and a sense that the war was over and old enmities should be left behind led him to respond. He wrote a long letter explaining his background as a farm mechanic, decades of experience keeping farm equipment running, and how he had applied this knowledge to aircraft engines. He explained the philosophy of improvisation and adaptation that had guided his work. Galland responded 2 weeks later with a letter that was remarkably frank. He admitted that the Luftwaffe had made the fundamental error of assuming that effective aircraft maintenance required extensive formal training in aeronautical engineering. They never considered that hands-on experience with complex machines of other types could be as valuable as formal education. This underestimation of unconventional expertise, Galland wrote, was one of many ways in which German arrogance contributed to defeat. Correspondence between McKenna and Galland continued sporadically for several years. They never met in person, but they developed a peculiar mutual respect. Two men who had been on opposite sides of conflict, but who could now recognize each other's professionalism and dedication. In 1954, McKenna was invited to participate in a conference on aircraft maintenance organized by the United States Air Force. Conference brought together engineers, military officers, and veterans to discuss lessons learned during war and applications for the future. McKenna, then 72, was by far the oldest person present. He was invited to give a presentation on field repair techniques. McKenna was not a comfortable public speaker. He had spent his life working with hands, not words, but he prepared careful presentation using hand-drawn notes and diagrams. His presentation, titled simply, "Keeping Machines Running When Manuals Say They Can't," was 20 minutes of practical wisdom distilled from 50 years of experience. He explained fundamental principles, listening to machines, feeling abnormal vibrations, understanding that problems are rarely as simple as manuals suggest. Audience, made up mostly of young engineers with advanced college degrees, initially listened with polite but clearly skeptical courtesy. But, as McKenna continued, giving specific examples of problems he had solved using principles that did not appear in textbooks, skepticism turned into genuine attentiveness. After the presentation, multiple engineers approached McKenna to ask questions. One of them, a young Air Force captain with a doctorate in mechanical engineering from MIT, said something that McKenna never forgot. "Sir, I spent 8 years studying engineering, but you taught me in 20 minutes something no professor has ever mentioned, that machines are not perfect theoretical systems, but complex physical devices that behave in ways that equations don't fully capture. Thank you for this lesson." McKenna finally retired, truly this time, in 1957, at the age of 75. He spent the last years of his life in relative peace in Topeka, surrounded by growing family that included 16 grandchildren and 23 great-grandchildren. He rarely spoke about time in the war unless specifically asked, and even then he kept answers brief and focused on technical work rather than heroism or drama. Robert James McKenna died on March 22, 1969, exactly 25 years to the day that the P-47 he had maintained flew a mission over Berlin. He was 87 years old. Funeral was small, family and friends from the local community. But 3 weeks later, the United States Air Force held a memorial at the Kansas City Air Force Base, inviting veterans of the 352nd Fighter Group who were still alive. 42 veterans attended, many now in their 50s and 60s, men who had been pilots in their early 20s when McKenna kept his planes flying. They each shared stories about old mechanics who cared too much, worked too hard, and saved lives through quiet dedication. Colonel Henderson, retired, and now 63, gave eulogy that perfectly captured McKenna's legacy. Bob McKenna, he said, represented something fundamental about the American spirit that won World War II. It wasn't our superior technology, although we had a lot of it. It was not the courage of our soldiers, although they were incredibly brave. It was our ability to mobilize unconventional expertise, to recognize that knowledge comes from many sources, to value practical experience as much as formal education. Bob was a farmer turned aircraft mechanic, and he proved to be as good as any Republic aviation engineer. He represents thousands of ordinary Americans who have done extraordinary things simply by applying decades of life experience to new challenges. The Germans underestimated us because they looked at Bob and saw an old farmer. We looked at Bob and saw expert in complex machines. This difference in perspective, multiplied throughout our military structure, was a crucial reason why we won. Henderson then told a story he had never shared publicly. In April 1945, weeks before the German surrender, Henderson had been present when American soldiers captured a Luftwaffe airbase near Frankfurt. Among documents recovered was an intelligence report on American maintenance capabilities. Report, written by a German officer who had interrogated American prisoners of war who were mechanics, contained a line that Henderson had memorized. Americans achieve impossible repair rates using unskilled elderly personnel. We must assume that reports are exaggerated or that we are fundamentally failing to understand their system. Henderson, reading that report at a captured German base, had laughed out loud. They just couldn't believe it, Henderson explained to the audience at the memorial. It did not fit into his worldview that expertise could come from farms and workshops instead of universities and academies. This conceptual blindness cost them war as much as any material deficiency. Bob McKenna and thousands like him won not just because they worked hard, but because the German system couldn't even recognize the value of what they brought. This is a lesson that remains relevant today and will remain relevant forever. Never underestimate people who have dedicated their lives to understanding complex machines and systems, no matter where they gained their education. Knowledge has many forms, and experience is as good a teacher as any university. After the ceremony, several of the former pilots approached Martha McKenna, now an 87-year-old widow. One of them, James Patterson, who had been a lieutenant when flying P-47 maintained by McKenna and was now a respected surgeon in Chicago, took Martha's fragile hand and said in an emotionally charged voice, "Ma'am, McKenna, your husband saved my life at least 3 times that I know of. Every time my plane suffered combat damage but continued flying when it shouldn't have, it was because of Bob's work. I wouldn't have made it to 26. I wouldn't have met my wife. I wouldn't have had my 4 children. I wouldn't have become a doctor who saved perhaps hundreds of lives over the course of my career. All of this exists because your husband cared enough to do his job better than anyone had a right to expect. He was a true hero, the kind who never gets headlines, but without whom victory would have been impossible." Martha thanked him with tears in her eyes. She knew that Robert would have been embarrassed by the compliments, that he would have insisted that he just did his job. But she also knew that he would have been deeply pleased to know that his work had mattered so much. Robert McKenna's story and thousands of civilian mechanics like him remains largely unknown outside specialized circles of military historians. There are no monuments to them, no Hollywood films dramatizing their contributions, but its impact on World War II was profound and measurable. Statistically, the American maintenance system that utilized unconventional civilian expertise allowed the United States Army Air Forces to maintain an average operational availability rate of 82% throughout the war, compared to 43% for the Luftwaffe in the same period.